Well, thank you, Adele, and good afternoon, everyone. So changing tack slightly after the two, I guess, macro-focused presentations. Yes, I'm going to really look at the silver market and really focusing on one particular area. In other words, looking at the use of silver in green technologies. But first of all, why are we thinking about silver and the industrial landscape? So this takes a sort of a snapshot over the past 30 odd years or so. And it was really quite interesting to put this together, going down memory lane, just reminding ourselves that 20, 30 years ago, the use of silver in photography was one of the key areas of the marketplace, consuming over 200 million ounces a year. And then as we move forward, the market was concerned about what would come in and sort of make up for those lost ounces. But what we've of course seen in terms of the industrial part of the marketplace is that has grown sort of almost uninterrupted over that time period. And in recent years, we've been setting sort of a series of record highs. And our estimate or our forecast for next year is just over 600 million ounces. So if we bring that back and really trying to get a sense of what's causing that. So as well as hitting the record high next year, we've already been doing that for the past couple of years. Now, in terms of 22, perhaps you can almost dismiss that by saying that was a sort of a post-COVID recovery. And of course, we're going to see a bit of a bounce. But what we've also seen is our estimates for this year is that industrial demand is expected to rise by around 10%. And the main reason for that is what we're seeing in the electrical and electronic space. Now, if you're familiar with the work that we do at Metals Focus and is silver industrial area, we do have other, I guess you could call them buckets for industrial demand. We spend a lot of time looking at the brazing market. We have a broad catch-all called other industrial demand, which includes the ethylene oxide, which is another success story in the silver market, but that's for another day. But in terms of the record high for this year for industrial demand, it's very much what we're seeing in the electrical and electronic space. And what I want to do initially is focus on the photovoltaic market. So the line you can see there is showing you the share of PV as a percentage of global industrial demand. And so what we've seen since around 2016 or so, that it's been broadly consistent in around the low 20s as a percentage share. But what also sort of jumps out at you in this chart is that over the past couple of years, how that has really sort of ramped up very aggressively. And our current estimate for this year is that it will be about 30% of the global market for the use of silver in industrial applications. So very quickly, we can see where that much, not all of it, but much of that 10% upside is coming from in terms of the industrial market. So if we drill down now into the PV market, and this is, I guess, this next couple of slides or three slides is both perhaps a strength and a threat to the marketplace. So first of all, 2010 seems like a very long time ago. We only had 17 gigawatts of global new capacity installed. And at that time, we had two countries, only two markets, which were installing at least 1 gigawatt. If we jump forward to 2019, we have 115 of global installs. Now we've got 16 markets, or 16 countries rather, which are installing at least 1 gigawatt. And so now I think that's really interesting because now we're getting a sense of the resilience. More countries are coming to the table. But what we're also seeing now is a risk that's emerging because that blue bar on the side there is China, which is accounting, even back then, for about a third of global installs. If we bring that up to date and our current estimates for this year, we have almost 400 gigawatts being installed. Yes, we've got 32 countries around that table reaching that threshold, but now we have China which is accounting for almost half of the global total. And so you can really cut that two ways. One, that commitment from China, really contributing and helping to drive PV and in turn the global industrial up so well this year. But that's an incredible reliance on one country. And I know, speaking to my colleague Elvis, and I should really thank him because based in Taiwan, he pulls together the PV models for us. He's responsible for that research. But for me, there is a question really, the extent to which China can maintain this level going forward. We've already seen a lot of their excess grid capacity being used up this year, but we are seeing going forward a lot of investment in terms of new infrastructure, and therefore in terms of what that means, a positive also for that grid capacity as well. So let's look at it a slightly different way now. And we are now thinking about the technologies that are important in the PV market. At the very bottom, and I appreciate at the back, that may be hard to see. I think the LBMA is making the presentation available afterwards, but also please do reach out to me if you want to get a copy of it as well. So these are the three main technologies at the moment. Now I know my presentation title was talking about risks to silver demand, what could derail it, but this so far is quite a positive slide for the PV market because each of these, going from left to right, is using more silver. And importantly, in terms of their attractiveness to be installed, each of those is a higher efficiency as well. If we now think about and try and think about how important each of these are in terms of their actual usage in the marketplace, and this slide is just looking at 21 to our forecast for next year, thinking about global new capacity. And so you can see that we are moving from this PERC to this TOPCon. Why does that matter? Well, simply put, TOPCon is using a lot more silver than PERC. That transition is quite, well, taking a 60,000 foot view, that transition is relatively straightforward. You don't need to put new machinery in if you're a panel manufacturer, if you're moving from PERC to TOPCon. The interesting one is this HJT, which you're just seeing starting to creep in. Again, in terms of the current technology, that also uses more silver. But as a panel manufacturer, you've got to rip it all out, put in new capacity for that. So that is obviously a significant headwind. And so what we are seeing there are new entrants are adopting this technology. So far I've been talking about more silver loadings, higher silver loadings, and yet we have this chart of our average silver loadings that we've indexed back to 2010. Now again, those of you that follow the market, this won't be surprising. We go back to 10, 11, 12, we think about the spike in the upside we saw in silver prices, and we saw how the market reacted to that quite aggressively. But I think it's perhaps a little misleading because before that, I don't necessarily think there was a huge focus in terms of thrifting silver. So I think, again, I'm an economist, not a scientist, but I think there's perhaps a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to quickly thrift a lot of the silver out. I think what's really important, though, is that even when prices backed off, been very weak for many years, we still saw that thrifting continue as aggressively as possible, even up until the current time. What's really interesting now, though, again, speaking to Elvis, is are we going to see that line start to plateau? And possibly yes, possibly no. The thing about HJT, which I mentioned, is a very high silver or higher silver content than its predecessors, but what's starting to tiptoe onto the market now is some silver-coated copper powder that perhaps could also be used in the HJT technology, so it can go one or two ways. And as you can probably imagine, if you're going from a relatively pure silver paste on the front side and back side, and you're thinking about introducing a silver-coated copper powder, that could have quite a dramatic impact on the PV market. But from our point of view, and again, speaking to Elvis, this is not something that's going to happen in the near term. This, from our point of view, perhaps could be a much longer term outcome. And again, there's also still the headwind. If you're a manufacturer and you've moved to TOPCon, are you even about to, again, rip all of that out and put in new machinery so you can adopt this new technology? So I think the jury is certainly out on that. But if we do have price upside, if prices were to escalate and really ramp up, then perhaps we would see that when we saw that loadings chart, instead of plateauing, maybe that would start to dip down as well. So there are certainly some risks out there, but I think overall we're still bullish for the at least the medium term for this marketplace. So with that, let's move on to the auto market. So for these slides, I'm very grateful to Wilma and Jake, who's here. Also happy he's here for the questions that come his way. So when we think about silver here, and although my presentation is really focusing on the green technologies, it's really important to really remember that even if the battery electric vehicle encounters headwinds, the use of silver in the automotive space is still pretty bullish, it's still very solid, and I think still has a strong future. So I think it's really important to perhaps make that distinction. So what are we looking at here? First of all, in terms of global light vehicle production, we have our forecasts going out in terms of the overall arc, you can see there. And then for the battery electric vehicle, we've got two scenarios, our base case, and below that, our derailed scenario. And you can see there is quite a margin there. And we're certainly, in terms of comments that are coming out, in terms of where legislation is as well, I think we are seeing pushback and an increased uncertainty in the BEV market. If we strip out the ICE component of that and now look just at the hybrids and again the battery electric vehicle, the hybrids again in terms of our base case is that red arc that you can see there. And now that we've stripped out the ICE, I think you get a much clearer picture of just between two scenarios, and we have other scenarios as well. But just the uncertainty that exists at the moment in terms of the battery electric vehicle space. But why does this matter? Well, put simply, when you move from an ICE to a hybrid to a battery electric vehicle, you are using a lot more silver. And I'm grateful to Neil, who's done a lot of work on modeling this. But I think he'll be the first to say that there is tremendous uncertainty in terms of trying to estimate how much silver is used in a car. Not just in terms of thinking about your forecasts for light vehicle production or what it means for battery electric vehicles, etc. But regionally, are you looking at higher loadings in the industrialized world versus emerging markets? Should you have lower loadings in a mass market versus the performance range, etc., etc. But so it is really quite tremendous in terms of that uncertainty that is out there. In terms of the companies that we speak to that are making the semi-finished product, I think we've got a pretty good handle at Metals Focus in who those guys are. But even for those, often they perhaps are unsure in terms of where is the final use, given that's going through so many layers of the supply chain. But of course, in terms of this market, given we're moving for most of the cost being from mechanical devices to electrical, for example, the battery management systems, this in turn requires a lot more semiconductors. Again, taking a 60,000 foot view, on average going from 500 to 800 semiconductor chips to 1,200 to 1,500. And so you get an idea of the order of magnitude that we're seeing in that marketplace. And of course, what's interesting in the vehicle, you know, lots more devices. We think about the cars that we all drive, the devices in those that we take for granted in an ICE, let alone moving to a hybrid or a battery electric vehicle. And of course, it's not just about the car, is it? We're looking at the infrastructure around that, the charging stations as well. So I think it is quite an exciting area out there. Now, I know speaking to Elvis and speaking to Noah, I've had to change how I think about this. I always thought that even perhaps the most rosy view of, say, I don't know, 3 ounces of silver in a car, what that means for the value of the car, it's derisory. It has no bearing whatsoever. And so I always thought, well, that would mean that the desire or the pressure to thrift or substitute will be very low. But if you are a manufacturer of a silver bearing component, so you're very far removed from your OEMs, and the price spikes, there is tremendous pressure on you to reduce the amount of silver that you're using. And so, you know, we are hearing about some manufacturers, perhaps from the mass market, maybe more in emerging markets as well, where there's a move perhaps from silver to silver-coated copper, from some devices to copper as well, which again, from our point of view as researchers, just makes it even more complicated trying to estimate silver offtake. And in spite of that, I have a slide of silver offtake. What I wanted to do with this slide really, though, is to just convey, I guess, a couple of things. One, we just put 2 or 3 scenarios on here. There's a whole multitude. Again, if you look at the modelling that Neil's done, really, it's very intricate. But again, it's trying to convey, as I mentioned earlier, that even in a scenario where if you're bearish the outlook for battery electric vehicles, you can still be bullish on silver offtake overall in the automotive space. But why does all this matter in terms of the PV market and the automotive sector? Well, if you're familiar with the research that we do, this is a slide that we often show. This is now, in a sense, bringing everything together and looking at the global surplus and deficit from 2010. And I think what perhaps jumps out from 2010 to 2020, relatively modest surpluses and deficits. But you can see how that really started to change in 21 as global demand started to outpace supply. 22 was a bit of an outlier, I think. I would be really quite shocked if we ever see a deficit of that magnitude again. But even if we don't, from our point of view, as a research house, we do think that we've entered a new dynamic in the marketplace of ongoing structural deficits. Perhaps we won't even get back to the deficit that we see in 2023 of around almost over 150 million ounces in terms of our current estimates. But I think that shouldn't detract from where we are. And I think in our view, this will eventually, not this year, what's left of it, not next year, but taking a longer view, this will start to inform and start to influence the silver price, could start to help to generate some upside. And again, taking the longer view and really crystal ball gazing, start to see the gold-silver ratio also narrow. And on that, I guess, somewhat positive point, so happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
What's the life of these photovoltaic panels, and what about recycling possibilities? I mean, presumably they last a long time.
Yes, so I think you're looking at around 20 years, 25 years.
And recycling, is it hard to recycle from those panels?
Yes, it's exceptionally hard, but you are starting to see some of that beginning to happen now. But what's really interesting, and this is part question, part answer, is that's obviously recycling cells which had much higher silver loadings. What will be really interesting going forward is, are they still economic when those loadings come off quite dramatically? But we are starting to tiptoe, but for many years it was just net, the gross demand was the net demand. So obviously real big contrast to photography, of course.
Don't underestimate car manufacturers' wish to cut every penny out of the construction. And I used to have a car that had a little handle above the door. Back in the cheap models, you didn't get the handle. I mean, I can't more than 50 cents. And they still took it out. So.
Yeah, I think that's where it's interesting. As I said, some of those that are now, if you go back, I don't know, 10 years, from a safety point of view, we're using gold in the connectors for your airbag and your brake. And if I'm honest, I assumed that was still the case, and that hasn't been for some time. I was quite shocked to find out it was silver. Great metal though, but yeah.
Just you make a compelling case that there's going to be a deficit
Yeah.
of silver. At the same time, we know the physical markets where, typically India and the likes, where they have a tendency to buy silver and then sell it when the market goes high. What do you think will be the incidence to have that come back and somewhat be a brake on price running away?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about this year, we've got our estimate for this year for perhaps the second highest deficit or one of the highest on record, and that's in spite of the the small coin and bar market, to be blunt, falling off a cliff much of this year. With India a lot quieter as well until maybe October. So I think that gives you a sense of the resilience that is there overall. I think in terms of India turning around and starting to liquidate, I think you would need to see, obviously it depends on what the rupee is doing, of course, as well. But we've had, it's not long ago that we had the record rupee silver prices, isn't it, really? So, and even then, you saw a lot of liquidations within India, but not much of that was coming out. The silver that was coming out was really only in the free trade zone, and that was just turned around and some of that. So, and I know if you go back, I think 10, 15 years, there have been times, of course, when it did, large volumes did come out. So, but I think you would need to see much higher prices, like another global financial crisis-esque, to see perhaps India not only liquidate, but liquidate to such an extent that you had that coming back into the market. That would obviously be a very different dynamic than our base case of those deficits, but that's not part of our base case.
Just one from me. Following up from Mehdi's question, and considering the deficits of particularly 2022 and the outlook you present here in terms of where industrial demand is, what will it take for investors to come back to the silver market? Don't look at me like that.
That's a good question. Well, I think to turn it around a little bit the other way, I mean, I think we agreed with Philippe in terms of the expectations when the Fed will cut. So from that point of view, I guess for next year, we are bearish investors. But it's interesting because if you go back a couple of years, there was a lot of focus on the PV market. And that was attracting investors, even though for that particular year, I think it was maybe 21 or 2020, that wasn't a new phenomenon. It's been around for a while, but it just, I think, caught the attention. So it'll be interesting to see, if these deficits do persist. I think that will in itself start to attract investors. I think that will probably be, honestly, will probably be the big thing, really. And maybe if, in terms of the, if we go into some of the industrial components, are we therefore proved wrong in terms of our outlook for battery electric vehicles, and something then is a positive step change? And I think those kind of dynamics playing together could perhaps attract investors.